I thought this week we'd lay some of Peco's new Bullhead Track, code 75, and also one of their sexy Unifrog points, and then ballast it. So stick around, let's see how we do it. Hi, welcome back to Chadwick Model Railway. I'm Charlie. And today I thought we'd have a look at laying and ballasting flexible track. Not only ordinary flexible track, but I thought we'd look at Peco's latest edition, which is their code 75 Bullhead. But why would you want to use flexible track in the first place? Well, it's all to do with your layout, because if you use set track, then using first, second, third and fourth radius curves is all you can do. It kind of dictates the way that you must build your layout, which to me is a little bit kind of dictatorial. And when you get away from set track, the world becomes your oyster then, and you can go and build and design whatever you like. So what have we got to work with? Well, I've knocked up this little board. It's a piece of 12mm ply, painted brown with some Hobbycraft sort of poster paint, reinforced with a few timbers, and these are 18mm by 44mm of planed timber, and held together with countersunk size 8 1.5 inch screws. So where do we go from here? So whistle stop tour of what you need. Well, I have two 3-foot lengths of code 75 Bullhead track. I have a Peco Streamline Bullhead 0000 scale code 75 SL-U1189 Unifrog left hand large radius turnout. There's a mouthful for you. We need some cork, so I have some cork. Clearly I don't buy the small rolls, need to get out more. What else do we need? We need some glue, so I'm using Evo stick to glue the cork down, and we need some pins to pin the track, and I use SL14 Peco track pins, but I keep them in a little jar, you know, these little jam jars from hotels. I use those. We need rail joiners, and SL-114 are the rail joiners for code 75 Bullhead. These are tiny. This will be quite interesting. To bang the track pins in, we need a pin vise, and these are half of 1mm track pins. So I have a 0.7mm drill to drill the pilot holes for the pins. I have an old Honda CB250 G5 valve, which I use as a drift to bang the pins in. I need a Peco 6-foot weigh gauge. We'll come to that in a bit, and some files to file the burrs off the track once I've cut them with a set of, can't I say this, Xuron track cutters, a couple of pairs of pliers and some snips. So that's all we need. What I need to do now is simply draw on a little track plan, which is a piece of track, a point, and the other two rails, and figure out what I'm going to do, and then stick the cork down. Now, because of the very nature of flexible track, i.e. it's very flexible, Peco also manufacture these track setter track templates, and they come in 18, 21, 24, 36 and 42 inch radius curves. There's also a straight one, and these are very helpful to make sure that you have a smooth curve rather than one that kind of jiggles around a bit, and also helps to remove the dog legs from your track joins. So always worth keeping these in mind. So I thought we'd have a point round about here, and then one track kind of curving away nicely over there, and perhaps the other one curving away similarly in this direction. So what must you do before you start nailing track down, well, obviously we need to put the cork down first, but it's to make sure that there's nothing underneath that's going to get in the way. So if you were to install a point motor here, then clearly you need to make sure there are no timbers underneath. There's only one timber underneath and it runs across here. And if I'm going to put cork over the top of this screw, I will mark on the cork whereabouts the screw is, so I don't start trying to nail track through the cork into this screw. I'm not sure if I mentioned the cork I'm using is 3mm cork. So now what I'm going to do is just simply mark out where the track is going to run. Now I've laid a sheet of cork on top of the board, which might seem a kind of wasteful way of doing it, but at the end of the day you'll still have all the offcuts, and you can always make strips to do in the straights, but to get this point mechanism easier, I find it easier just to lay the cork and cut it. Once you've figured it out, cut the cork and take it from there. So what I need to do is think about, these are the two tracks that are going to kind of diverge, and there'll be a little bit of track here coming into this point. So how do I get the profiles right on these two tracks? Well, I'm going to go for a 42" on this line just here. So we'll come out of there and then bring that just down onto this other little bit. Down here is where this one will run, to get that nice and smooth. And then on the other, we'll use the 36 and make it a little bit tighter. And then, as you can see, it keeps the track nice and the curve nice and consistent. So that's where that one will run there. So all I need to do now is mark out where these tracks are, and then cut the cork accordingly, and we should have a reasonable track bed. Now you can cut cork with quite a few items really. You can use a scalpel. This is quite thick cork. I mean, a scalpel wouldn't struggle, but it's probably not the best way. A craft knife, you know, sort of Stanley knife type blade. And you can also, if it's straight, use scissors, which is one of my kind of favourite options. And then we have to go straight. So what I shall do now is whip the track off and then cut it up. So that's the cork cut up, and I've also run a line just on the board itself, just so I know where to glue it back down to, and we should be good. Right, next comes the Gorilla Glue. I think it's worth mentioning at this stage that I have made some terrible mistakes gluing down cork in the past, and I had used PVA, and it was an absolute disaster because I'd weighted them down with books, and as it dried it came straight through the cork, and then kind of started to glue all the books down. So it was an embarrassing disaster is the only way I can really describe it. It was absolutely awful. But with this Gorilla Glue, I must confess, I used it in the past, and I used it the other day actually when I did the river scene. I don't know if you saw that, and it was really good and really effective glue, very, very kind of grabby, and I'm sure in this instance it will be just as good. Why don't I do something sensible here and cut that, and we do it in two pieces. Okay. Okay, that little piece will go into there. And there's no screws underneath for me to mark up. I just need to add a little section in there, obviously cut that a little bit short. And now I need to put some weights on here and then give it half an hour, and hopefully we should be ready to lay track. Now, whilst we're waiting for the glue to dry, I do realise that I switched from Evo Stick to Gorilla Glue, and the reason I did that was I used this stuff on the river scene, and it's brilliant. I forgot I had it, and I believe it's more effective for holding cork down. So that's the Gorilla Glue, the Gorilla Wood Glue is what I've used. Right. I want to just talk for a moment about track geometry. And in the previous videos, I've mentioned about first radius curves, and people have sort of queried what I'm on about. So that's a first, a second, a third and fourth radius curves. And if I go into the Peco catalogue, it says in here that the radius of them are, and I'll do them in old money first, 14 5/8 radius, 17 1/4, 19 7/8 and 22 1/2, or 371 mil, 438 mil, 505 mil and 571 mil. Now the track setter templates that I mentioned earlier, 3 of them are kind of in the same area as these. That's a 17 and I think it was 5/8, this is an 18. That's a kind of 22, this is a 21, and that's a 24, and that one is a 22 1/2. So they kind of fit in. And the reason I mention them is these would dictate the way your layout design goes, and because you cannot deviate from a set track, you can you can get half tracks, you try to turn them, but using flexible track really is the difference between a decent model railway and an enthusiast's layout. I do understand that some people don't have the size to have bigger layouts, and they are restricted to, say, second and third radius curves, and that's what life has dealt us. But if you can have second and third radius curves, you could also do them in flex track and get a more of a what's the word I'm looking for? Authentic layout, let's say. Right. And the other thing I want to talk about is, and wagons, when companies produce wagons, they recommend that the tightest curve they should move on is second radius curve. So it's this one here. So this really is a Thomas the Tank Engine type curve. However, if you look at my very first video number 1, you will see that I've used that on an exhibition layout on the hidden curves, and everything went around that curve except for one Bachmann warship, which would only go around those curves in one direction. I don't know why either, but most stuff will go around a first radius curve, but if it's in a display area, it looks dreadful. Let's just talk about straight track a moment. Now here we have 4 pieces of Hornby set track, and this is set at the streamline distance, and this is set at the set track distance. And I mentioned earlier about a Peco 6-foot weigh gauge. Now the 2 lumps here dictate the correct spacing for set track, whereas those 2 lumps dictate the correct spacing for streamline, for the flexible track. And as you can see, this is much more authentic than this. And the reason these are so far apart is because when you use set track points, because they're much more agricultural, people aren't going to like that, are they? Then it forces the tracks apart. But here it's much more authentic, Though when you go into the bends, these will go straight into those first, second, third or fourth radius curves because of the distances they're apart. Whereas when these go into your bends with your flexi-track, you then have to pull them apart so you get adequate clearance in case you're using long coaches such as Mark 3s, Mark 4s, that kind of coach. So that's the guts behind track geometry, and I hope that makes sense. Well, here we are back with our corks well glued down, and I've just popped on the track and the point. So what do we need to do next? Well, the next thing you need to think about is how you're going to power this track. Now, in many previous videos, I'm sure you've seen me solder dropper cables onto each individual piece of track and then drill one hole through the center of the cork and then drop the feeder wires down. The dropper cables come down and they'll all go to a bus or your DCC kind of feed, but they all need to be powered. And the same goes for the point. But one thing worth mentioning is Peco's leap forward with this uni-frog point. And it all comes down to, as you'd expect, the frog. The clue, of course, is in the name. You can use it either as an electro frog or as an insual frog point, because here in the frog, the two metal parts are actually separated. So if you were to use it as an insual frog, then you wouldn't power the first section, and it would be treated very much like the metal section, the plastic section of an insual frog point. There will be no power on this front section. Or you can power just that front piece up with an ordinary dropper wire, as you can see there, and then you would naturally switch the current on the front edge of that frog every time you change the point. Whichever way you use it, these back ends of the V are always powered correctly. And so it's at this stage whether you decide to use it as a traditional electro frog or a traditional insual frog. And now is the time you make your mind up. You could, of course, just take the cable off, thread it through the board, and then not connect it up, and then use it as an insual frog, and you'll have access to that cable should you change your mind in the future. At the end of the day, if you get poor running because you haven't powered that first part of the frog, you can always do it as a later date. Right, so let's say that I've put my dropper cables on and they're ready to go. So what would I do next? Well, the first thing to do is, as I've mentioned in the past, this will dictate where everything goes. So I need to install the point. Now, in my previous videos, you'll be aware that I don't necessarily use cork anymore. I tend to use the Woodland Scenics foam track bed because I have an obsession with noise. I understand that most people don't do that. They use they use cork, which is why I'm using cork on this video. And most people pin their track rather than glue it. So I shall pin this. There is an advantage with pinning, of course, because if you change your mind, you can pull the pins out. If you've glued it, it makes it much more difficult. And because of the fragility of this Bullhead Code 75, I wouldn't suggest that you glue this and then change your mind, because I think lifting this back up once you've glued it will probably destroy it. You wouldn't want to destroy these points. They are quite pricey. So let's set about installing this point, and then we'll take it on from there into the tracks. And one other thing before we pin this down is, if you're using a slow action point motor, you will need to remove the spring which ensures that the point has a positive lock across on the switch blades. But as we're not, we're ready to go. Now what I intend to do is to pin this down with 4 pins, and I think I'll go for one on either side of the lead into the point, and then one on the outside as the point comes out. So with my, I think it was a 0.7mm drill, then we'll put the first one in. I don't know if you've seen on other layouts, but some people make the mistake of pinning their track through the center of a sleeper, and some track has sleeper holes bored in them, and the trouble is then you get this terrible dip where the pin comes in and holds the sleeper down and bends the sleeper. So hopefully that will go into the hole I just drilled, and then tap it in slowly, and hopefully we don't bend it over. And there we are. And it's quite hard to see the pin. Great. And don't apply too much pressure, because obviously the drill is quite fragile, and it soon makes short work of going through the plastic of the sleeper, and then obviously the cork, it just goes straight through and down to the bottom. And then when you pull it out, try not to move the point. And another SL14. And I only want it to bang it in a couple of millimeters really, because these pins are quite fragile. And that's two. Two more to go. Okay, and that will be absolutely fine. Now, I mentioned that these SL-114 fish plates might be a challenge. The reason I said that is there is a code 100 fish plate, there's a code 75 fish plate, and here is a code 75 bullhead fish plate. So it clearly is quite small. So wish me luck on trying to fit one of these fish plates onto the point. Oh, there we go. This is quite fiddly. It may have been easier to fit these 6 fish plates before I installed the point. Anyway, I'll just fit the rest and then I'll get back to you. There's clearly a knack to it. Once you get into the rhythm of it, it's not too difficult. But I certainly couldn't attempt this without this visor. My eyesight just isn't good enough. And you can even see the bolt marks on these fish plates. So that's a challenge. I've changed my mind about the point. It's easier to fit the fish plates if the point's in place, because obviously if that wasn't nailed down, I wouldn't be able to put the fish plates on, because that would be wiggling around. But there we go. So the fish plates are on. It does look good, but without the optivisor, I would have been completely stuffed. I've seen a couple of videos of other people trying to fit this fish plate, and I think I've got off quite lightly. So what do you do now? Well, now we'll move on to the first piece of track. We'll fit that on and see how we get on. Well, as you'd expect, the first thing to do is to thread this track into these fish plates, and then once it's in, pop the track setter in and then nail the track down, or sorry, pin the track down and take it from there. This might be slightly harder than before, because now, of course, I have 2 tracks to thread into the fish plates. I've pulled one through slightly further than the other, so I can actually try and attempt one rail at a time. Ooh, right, there's one on. I need to pull that fish plate back a bit, otherwise it'll end up coming out. I'm so worried about... Okay, right. Now we want to thread the second... Oh, and there goes the second one. Oh, that wasn't that hard, was it? So here's the 36-inch radius track setter, and it all looks pretty good. Of course, I don't leave a gap between my rails, but you may need to in yours. If you have your model railway in an attic or in a garage and you get severe temperature fluctuations, then you may choose to use to leave a gap, especially if you're working in the cold and they bust right up, because if you're in an attic and suddenly it gets warm, you may well get buckling of your track. Now, one mistake I have made is that I need to trim off a small section from this sleeper. This isn't the rail cutters. These are made by Zero again, but this is actually a plastic fret cutter. So I'm just going to trim a little piece off there. That's lovely, nice and sharp these are. But never get those mistaken for the rail cutters. And then when I bring in that other piece of track, I'll need to do the same with this sleeper here. Yep. So now it's very much a case of repeating the process we did before, and that is to secure this piece of track before we go on up here. So we need to square up the sleepers, make sure they're nice and square. And drill a couple of holes to secure this end. So that was quite simple. So with this end secure and the track setter there to show us the gentle curve as it runs away, all I need to do now is to secure this track, and I'll put another couple of pins in here, another couple at the end, whilst I leave the track setter in there, and then I'll move on and do the other tracks. Well, that went reasonably easily. I thought it would be more difficult to negotiate these fish plates when I saw them, and thought, no pressure there then, Charlie. So all the tracks are on. There's still some play in them because I've only pinned them at both ends and in the middle, and we're all good to go. So what to do next? Well, now we need to trim away some of this excess cork and give it a little bit of a chamfer prior to ballasting. So using something like a Stanley knife or an X-Acto blade, all you need to do is run along at an angle and remove the excess cork. So if I try it along here, trying to keep away from the sleepers, obviously. And the slight chamfer will aid with ballasting, and hopefully there's not too much glue underneath this segment. There we are, a little bit there. And so it's a case now of just running through the whole of this cork and just remove the excess. Well, that's the cork trimmed, and I've established a bit of a ballast shoulder, so hopefully that should look pretty good once it's ballasted up. Well, the next thing to decide is, should you paint the track before you ballast? Now, I do like to give it a little bit of a spray because it removes the plasticky look of plastic sleepers, as you'd expect, but it also gives the rails a coat of sleeper grind. It takes the shine off them, because the last thing railway sleepers do is shine on the sides. I mean, it just doesn't happen. A lot of people paint rust on the sides of the rails as well, and I kind of understand that. But from when I see rails, they don't tend to look that rusty. It's just the kind of griminess to them. Of course, you can always argue about the colour that the sleepers should be, because here are photographs, whereas they don't look sleeper grime colour, and if anything they look a little bit more on the grey side. So there's no right or wrong way of doing this, but what I intend to do is just a little bit of a masking of this timber with some tape, and then just give it a quick blast of Rail Matches Sleeper Grime. Now this is a oil-based paint, so all I'll do is I'll whip outside and give it a quick spray. It's a bit windy, but we'll see how we get on. Okay, quick blast on there then, and it was Rail Match Sleeper Grime, and it's item number, excuse me, 1406 from Rail Match 1406. Sleeper Grime comes in a 150 milliliter can, and I think it has to come sort of special delivery. Won't come raw mail because it's inflammable. And hopefully you can see now the track is just sort of drying off now. So we'll give that an hour or two, and then we can tackle the ballasting. So first we need to look at the various ballasts that are available. One of the problems I find with going to model railway shows is you end up buying too much stuff, and ballast is clearly something that I've invested in the past. But they kind of go into two camps really. There's medium ballast, such as Woodland Scenic's medium ballast grey blend, or there is fine ballast. For some reason people kind of think that fine is for N gauge and medium is for 00. It's not really, because medium on a 00 is awful, and I've made that mistake in the past. You really need fine. I think the medium should be really aimed at the O gauge market and the fine ballast at 00. And to go along with this fine ballast, this one here is mixed, so it's a grey blend, so hopefully you can see there are two different colours inside, and you can get fine buff, you can get fine grey, you can get, well, that's a medium, Peco, that's a, what's this one called, fine grade weathered ballast grey, and what else we got, light grey fine, medium light grey. So there are enough to say there are loads of them. So what I'm going to do is we put another Peco track down, so we might as well use a bag of Peco ballast. So this is it's Peco's PS305 weathered ballast grey fine grade, approximately 250 grams. The other favourite I've got must be Woodland Scenic's fine ballast, this one here, and that's another good one. And it comes in a handy container. Not that I pour it out of here, you'll see the way I do things in a bit. So there's loads of ballasts available. Whenever you go to a model railway show, don't go and buy another load of ballast. The box over there has still got other stuff in it, and when I went through and put all my ballasts into a box, I was thoroughly embarrassed to see what I'd bought. But I can always move it on. The Model Railway Club can always use some. But there we go. So for 00, I would tend to go for fine ballast, and I go for a grey blend because it breaks up the colour more. A couple of hours have now gone by because I need to leave the paint time to harden, and I also I put some blue tack in the point blades of the blades that were open. The ones that were closed, so I need to remove the blue tack from there. And also run a track rubber along the top of the rails just to remove the paint from the top. Some people wipe the paint off whilst it's still dry, but I tend to think that you end up wiping away some of the paint on the sides of the rails besides that on the top. So I'll just finish this off and get back to you. And so to ballasting. So what have I got with me? Well, I use a ballast hopper, and there should be a link in the Show More tab down below. And if you've got one or buying one, buy one with a little door, because that way you can stem the flow. And I think there's one from Prozis that I kind of like. So we have our ballast hopper, and we've obviously got some ballast. I've decanted the Peco bag into here to make it a little bit more pourable as it was. I have a spoon for vibration, I'll show you that in a bit. And I've got a couple of brushes on standby should I need to brush some of the ballast into place. And then once the ballast is laid, I have a vacuum cleaner, which is down below, and one of my wife's old tights, bless her, to suck up any excess ballast, and obviously gets caught in the tights, and I can then recycle it and use the ballast again. And then once that's all in place, we need to turn to the gluing side. And as I'm not going to use isopropyl alcohol as a wetting agent here, I'm going to use just ordinary water with a couple of drops of washing up liquid. If you've got any IPA, you're better off using it as a hand sanitizer in these strange times. And for glue, I've got some good old 50-50 water and PVA. And again, a couple of drops of washing up liquid, and to put that on, I use a pipette. I don't use a syringe. I find that when you spray the syringe, it kind of goes everywhere. So this is much easier to drip it on. So the adventure begins. And so, with the hopper in place on the tracks and the door closed, we fill up the hopper. Then we open the hopper door and then run the hopper along the rails. Just try to make the action quite smooth. Of course, the ballast is gritty, so it will try and stop it. And you can see you've got a reasonably even spread. There's a little bit missing there, but not to worry. And then the next thing we do is we induce a little bit of local vibration, and this is where the magic happens. If I zoom you in, and as you can see, most of the ballast then comes away from the sleeper tops. And I think it's quite remarkable, really, I must confess. There's a little bit missing here, so we shall just decant a little bit by hand into this area just here. And it's probably because I've been a little bit too liberal. I've left too much cork showing, so I probably should have removed a little more cork from that edge. But I think that is so much easier than running along with a teaspoon slowly decanting ballast onto your railway. Okay, so let's move along to the point. And it's worth mentioning here that instead of having joins on these switch blades, this is the same piece of metal that runs all the way up to here. However, the movement only comes from here to here. So again now, it's a case of, with our little dispenser, we just run up, whoops, I'm leaving ballast everywhere, and do wherever we can with the dispenser. So there we are, right through the point. And all I need to do again is add the vibration, and this time I'm just going to use my finger to take away some of the excess. Now, of course, the thing to be careful of here is we need to remove the ballast that's between the switch blades. So the blades will move freely before we even dream of getting out any glue. We're just about ready now for the glue, but I have been using my little nifty handheld vacuum cleaner just to do a little bit of husbandry really on the outside. I haven't removed every single piece of ballast from the tops of the sleepers, because in reality it isn't all removed. The main thing that really matters is this point works perfectly. There's no grit at all in the action of the point, and there'll be no glue whatsoever in this section here or around here. And of course these areas here must be clear of ballast so that the points can mate fully. And also on this point is these check rails have to be clear as well, because the tolerances here are obviously quite small. So I think we're good to go, and I'll start the other end with the glue and work my way along. As I mentioned previously, the first thing to do is to spray it with water, and this is the water and washing up liquid mix. I'm just trying to get it to come out without excessive force, so it needs to be nice and wet. And the thing is now is not to get involved with your fingers. So I'll just do the rest of it. So that's all the ballast wetted. And now it's time to turn to the glue. And nothing could really be more straightforward with this. What I tend to do is I run down the centre, and it tends to run out itself into the edges of the track. And I keep doing this until it stays white, and that way I can be assured that it is saturated with glue. Now, because I haven't used isopropyl alcohol, this will take more time to dry, sadly. And I wouldn't dream of touching it now, even if whatever mistakes I make, except for the point blades, I would not touch this, because it will go all clumpy and you'll never sort it out. If it goes to rats now, just don't worry about it. You'll sort it out in the morning. If, of course, you've made any mistakes before you put the glue on, you can, before you put the water on, you can always rectify them, even if even it's a case of taking the vacuum cleaner and taking everything off. But this stage here now, this is the kind of the crucial bit, and just lay the glue in. And in the morning, if there's any areas that are glued down, where you put too much ballast down or whatever, sorry, not in the morning, but a couple of days later, once it's had a real good chance to dry out, that's the time when you can just chip away at the bits you don't want. So now we're getting towards the more delicate part now of this point action. And this section of the point, the blades don't move. If you do make a catastrophic mistake with these points, all is not lost, because if you pour water on it, it tends to soften the PVA because it's a water-based liquid, and if it's hot water, it comes off even easier. And it's how I lift track and save points for new projects. Now a little bit more delicate now, because I just want to do the ballast inside without getting it on the point blades. And I imagine there's some people watching this absolutely cringing now. Then go to the other side of the point, and I can't go beyond this section here. Now I feel quite confident that that point area is quite safe. But of course the only thing that will tell it is tomorrow morning when I come back up here and see if it still runs freely. I know there's some folks who don't use watered down PVA on the point. They actually just use a dollop of PVA, sort of neat PVA, and take it from there. But we all do things differently. Right, hopefully we're good to go. There's no ballast whatsoever in the action. So all we can do really is come back in the morning and check it out. See you tomorrow. Well, it's now the following day and it's 20 to 12 in the morning. I finished laying the glue last night at about 7:30. And the way I shoot my videos is I shoot a segment and then I take it to the computer, upload it into the program, do the edit, and then I do the next section. Therefore, if I get a failure of a piece of video, I can reshoot it without sort of wasting hours and hours. But it was during that edit I noticed that in this area of the point here, when you see the point switch, the blades move, you can see that there is PVA against the switch blade. Now I don't mean to sort of cheat, but I then came back to the layout and I dried out that glue before I went back, and I also left the point blades in the central position. I didn't leave them against one blade or the other. I left the switch blades central before I turned in, because I didn't obviously wanted to minimize the risk of the switch blades gluing up. So dose of honesty, but this morning things are looking pretty good. So let's just see how we've got on. Well, I think it's fair to say that it's turned out pretty good. But of course the main worry is this point arrangement. And zooming right in, it didn't take much to free this point up. There was a little bit of stickiness to it, but now it moves fairly easily. It's kind of, I suppose, 95% of where it was in the first place. The main thing is it doesn't take any excess. It still has its clicky kind of aspect with the point spring, and of course what you've got to watch out for is little bits of ballast in these grooves here, and there is some in there. They just need cleaning out, but the main thing is that the point is free to move. Looking at the rest of it, there's a few gaps around, no big deal. So a little bit of glue and a little bit more ballast to be added here and there, but nothing substantial. The colour of the sleepers is a little bit more milky now because of the PVA, and some of the PVA has got a bit of a shine to it for some reason. I haven't seen that, but obviously that particular mix, which is dial from B&Q, does have this a little bit of a shine to it. Just so I don't know if you can see it there, it's a little bit kind of glossy. Pieces to be very aware of is to make sure there's no debris stuck in the grooves of the frog, and also these check rails to make sure they're clear. There's also the odd piece of ballast that's kind of stuck on sleeper tops, and you can always scrape them off. But it's only been sort of, what is it? About 14 hours, I think, since this glue was put down. So this ballast is still very, very soft. It has by no stretch of the imagination hardened off, and it's still a little dark. It will lighten up. So you can't start going around prodding this stuff because it will sort of start to come away in clumps. So be very cautious about going in and modifying, start ripping out all these bits of ballast. It's okay to flick the odd one off the top, but nothing more serious than that. You really don't want to start prodding into here. So looking up close to the rest of it, I think it looks pretty amazing. And I'm not talking about my ballasting, I'm actually talking about the quality of the track from Peco. This Bullhead Track really is a bit of a game changer if you're into fine scale modelling and you don't want to sort of modify your engines and rolling stock into EM or P4 kind of gauge. But how does it compare to ballasting on standard Code 100 track? Well, behind now there's another little bit of a test track that I built for a different video. And if I zoom in nice and close, hopefully you can see that the sleeper spacing is much more compact, and this ballast is a little bit more coarse. Whereas if I drop down to the one we've just done, and let the camera refocus, and there you can see the current sleeper spacing is far more authentic, and the ballast looks pretty good. Well, that just about wraps this one up, and except to say that this ballast will dry much lighter grey, just like the other ballast on that other little piece of test track that I showed you. But what have I learned from this? Any mistakes, that sort of thing? Well, I use 3mm cork, which does produce quite a large ballast shoulder. And if you were to use 3mm, you might consider actually using 2mm if you didn't want such a severe shoulder. My water spray bottle was was dreadful. It just seemed to shoot out everywhere and soak the whole board. IPA is much better, but under the current circumstances, I've earmarked my IPA for hand washing and that kind of sanitizing, and I'm sure you're aware of its usefulness in that field. Peco have done a good job with this track. I do like it, but I particularly like the quality of the point. I didn't realise until I'd taken this point out of the packet exactly what a leap forward the Unifrog range of points is. I mean, that really is good, and to be able to switch it from a initial frog to an electro frog, it just beggars belief. Makes you wonder why we haven't been doing this, and of course that the point blades are so long and there's no extra join in there to lose your conductivity. So that's a great leap forward as well. Yeah, I like it. Hopefully you've learned something about ballasting and also ballasting around points. It isn't that easy. It isn't that hard, and as I said, if you get stuck, you can always just pour hot water on it after a few days and oink out the bits that are sort of stopping the point from functioning properly. If there's a point motor underneath, of course, you might need to remove it before you sort of put gallons of boiling water all over it. It's probably not such a good idea, especially if it's a rather pricey sort of slow action one. But there we are. So that really just wraps this one up. I hope this has been useful and you've enjoyed it. It's been a bit of an epic, I know, and you're probably just quite hyper on drinking too much tea and coffee, but there we go. All I need to do is wrap up to say thank you very much to my patrons and those that donate to me. And of course, please don't forget to subscribe. It is free, and there should be a video here and here. And I'll see you next Friday, 12 o'clock. It's a date. Take care. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.